Good afternoon. Welcome to Intelligent Talk with Ralph McElvenney. Join us every Thursday at 5 p.m. on the City World Radio Network as we discuss topics in politics, art, and current events.
Okay, welcome to Intelligent Talk. IntelligentTalk.com is our website. We're very pleased to have Rick Gillespie on today. Rick is an expert on a subject that's of interest to mine, which is the fate of Amelia Earhart. He's the head of TIGHAR, T-I-G-H-A-R, which stands for the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery. And Mr. Gillespie, thanks for coming on the program today.
It's my pleasure. And incidentally, we pronounce that tiger, just like the animal.
Oh, I'm sorry, tiger. Yes, okay, tiger. I stand corrected. So obviously, I'm familiar with your story. I read your book, Finding Amelia. It fascinates me. But just to go back a little bit, you are a pilot and you were an accident investigator. Is that right?
That's right.
And you work for an insurance company and you weren't particularly happy in that? Is that basically your background?
Well, I was happy at first. It was a great flying job. I got to travel around and visit. I was doing mostly general aviation, light aircraft, and visiting small airport operations and handling their insurance operations, risk management, and acting as an insurance adjuster, investigating accidents, settling claims. And that was the part of it that I enjoyed the most. I wasn't thrilled with being an insurance man, but I loved aviation, I loved the flying, and I've always had a passion for aviation safety. That stems from an unfortunate incident when I was younger. I watched a few friends die in a mid-air collision, and it was a bit traumatic, and I was committed to trying to keep that sort of thing from happening. So, but I did reach a point with the insurance industry where, because of changes in the industry, rate increases, and product liability legislation and litigation, I saw the insurance industry killing the general aviation industry.
Okay. And
I felt like a bad guy. And I decided not to do that anymore.
Now, sorry.
And about the same time that was happening, in my personal life, things were kind of going to hell. I was in the middle of a divorce and the financial trouble that comes with that often. And so I reached a point where freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. And I said, well, I did all the stuff I'm supposed to do and hasn't turned out all that great. I love the accident investigation work, but I'm not happy with the insurance work. So now I'm going to do what I want to do. My college degree is in history. It's just a bachelor's degree, but it's in history. And I've been committed to aviation and interested in aviation history. And maybe it would be possible to start a nonprofit foundation that approached aviation historical investigation as a real science and discipline rather than grave robbing and treasure hunting. And to my very good fortune, the young woman who had the poor judgment to come along with me, and now my wife, we started an organization we called the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, acronym to TIGHAR. And the concept was that it would be an open source historical foundation. We would recruit volunteer members who would assist in the investigations and, if appropriate, recoveries, expeditions, a very active sort of organization. And the concept was that there would be enough of these members to cover the basic operating costs, and then we do special fundraising for special projects. It's a great concept. It was never viable. I don't recommend this as a way of making a living. But we've managed to keep it alive and keep it going and keep it growing for 33 years now.
Okay.
So,
well, Mr. Gillespie,
right.
let me get into some of. Obviously, your most famous investigation is the Amelia Earhart, and you looked at finding Glenn Miller's plane, the famous band leader who disappeared in World War II, and others. But as I said, your most famous investigation is the Amelia Earhart. Just for people who don't remember, she was flying around the world, 1937. The last leg of the journey was it was early July 1937. She was flying from New Guinea to try to reach Howland Island. There was a Coast Guard cutter there to assist her, and with the radio trafficking, I think it was something like 2,500 miles, 2,500 miles in 19 hours. Obviously, you go into great detail about this in your book, but I'd just like to explain, if you could, Amelia Earhart of that flight was with Fred Noonan, who'd been a former Pan Am navigator. Could you just briefly explain to me how they were planning to do the navigation of that trip and the navigation status at that time, how they did navigate?
Sure. The leg of the trip from Lane, New Guinea to Howland Island was, of course, the most difficult leg, and Earhart acknowledged this. 2,500 miles and change, almost entirely over ocean, much of it at night. So the navigational technique they planned to use is the same navigational technique that Noonan helped pioneer for Pan Am. Pan Am had been flying scheduled passenger service across the northern Pacific for nearly a year. And the way they did that was for example, a Pan Am clipper would take off from Alameda, California, and follow a radio bearing provided by a radio direction finding station on the coast for as long as they could, be 200 or 300 miles out. After that, Noonan would take over, and using celestial navigation, sightings of the sun and stars, and dead reckoning, to keep the airplane more or less on course until they were close enough to the next radio direction finding station. In this case, it would be at Makapu Point on Oahu in Hawaii, where the radio operator aboard the Pan Am Clipper would send signals. The station on the ground would take a radio bearing and say, okay, you need to fly heading so-and-so to get to where we are. And they would fine-tune their approach into Hawaii that way. Then they would take off from Hawaii and fly outbound on a heading, on a radio bearing until they out of range. And then when they were within range of the next station at Midway Island, they would pick up again with a radio bearing. And that's the way they hopscotched their way across the northern Pacific. It was a great system. It worked well, but it did rely on ground-based radio direction finding stations and a radio operator aboard the aircraft. Noonan didn't do radio. His job was celestial navigation and dead reckoning. The Clippers had a dedicated radio operator, and that turned out to be the Achilles heel in the Earhart operation.
Okay. Now, when Charles Lindbergh did his trip 10 years before to Europe, he didn't have radio frequencies, I guess. He was just doing dead reckoning, I assume. But obviously, he had a lot bigger target, which was an entire Europe rather than just a small island in the Pacific. Is that right?
That's right. The term Lucky Lindy was accurate. He just took off, picked the compass heading, adjusted it, and that's the same way Earhart flew the Atlantic 5 years later in 1932. It's a gutsy way to do it, but if you have a big target like the European continent, it works.
She was the first woman to fly the Atlantic, right, if I recall?
That's right. She was the first woman to fly the Atlantic as a passenger, and she was the first person to fly the Atlantic and did it solo after Lindbergh.
Okay.
So, although she didn't do what Lindbergh did. Lindbergh flew from New York to Paris, 3,700 miles. Earhart flew from Newfoundland, got lost, and ended up in Ireland, 1,700 miles. So very different, but she did it on the 5th anniversary of his flight, which was very clever. And so she was the first person to cross the Atlantic after Lindbergh.
Okay, so Mr. Glenn, I want to get into very soon the radio transmissions that Amelia did, which I think is your strongest evidence that she survived that. But before I do, I just want to ask her, some of her last radio transmissions were flying along the line. But before I even ask you about that, there was some noise that Fred Noonan was sort of a drunk. Did you think that contributed at all to the problems they had with that flight? Was there any evidence that caused any problems, that he was drinking? Do you know of?
No, I've never seen any indication that Noonan's drinking was a factor in the disappearance. Noonan was not the super accurate, top of the line navigator that he's often made out to be. He didn't have a drinking problem for most of his career. He did apparently develop a drinking problem during his last days at Pan Am. That's why he quit the company. But he was apparently on the wagon and recovering by the time he was working with Earhart.
Okay, so Mr. Gillespie, your theory is that they missed the island. The Itasca, the Coast Guard cutter, hears some transmissions from her. One of them is flying along the line, which is, I believe, 157 degrees. Is that right?
Well, it's what's known as a line of position. And if you understand that Noonan, during the night, has not been able to keep the plane on course using sightings of the stars because they've had it overcast.
Okay.
He can't see the stars. So the first chance he gets to check their progress is when the sun comes up, and he can take a bearing, he can take a sighting of the sun. And because dawn moves across the face of the earth at a predictable direction and time, if he sights the sun soon after it's up and notes the time very precisely with his chronometer, he can draw a line on his map that is 90 degrees to the rising sun. On that day, the sun rose at 67 degrees. So he can put a line on his map that goes 90 degrees to that, 337 degrees one way, 157 degrees the other way. He'll know that he's someplace on that line. He won't know if he's up north, down south, or right on course. But he can take that line, knowing how fast he's going, he can advance that line theoretically until it falls through his destination, Howland Island, and say, okay, in whatever it is, an hour and 12 minutes, we should be on that line that Howland Island is on. If we're right on course, we'll look out the window and there the island will be. But if we don't see the island, at least we'll know it's off to the left or off to the right, and then it's just a matter of running up and down the line until we find it.
Okay, so just for time wise, I'm just going to sort of skip to the point. Your theory is that they missed the island, but they're able to find what was then called Gardner Island. They basically land on a reef near the island, and I think the strongest evidence that you have for that is the amazing amount of radio signals that was transmitted, which obviously couldn't have been transmitted if the plane had crashed. It was either floating in the water or just crashed and sunk. I mean, you have a woman in Florida, Betty Klink, who picked up transmissions. You had the Coast Guard cutter. You had Pan Am Airlines radio signals. You had a British warship. I mean, could you just describe some of the radio signals that were picked up after she was supposedly lost, which I think is the strongest evidence that she survived that crash?
Well, I agree with you. It is the strongest evidence. And we have at least 57 receptions of radio distress calls that were suspected of being from Earhart at the time that can only have been from Earhart. Let's talk about the Pan American signals. Now, Betty Klink, the girl in Florida, is great because she transcribed what she actually heard Earhart saying, and that's very dramatic and very credible. But the ones that really nail it are the Pan American signals. These same direction-finding stations we were just talking about in Hawaii and Midway and Wake Island are taking bearings on these calls, and the bearings are crossing at Gardner Island. And there's no way they can be sent from anybody but Earhart. There are no transmitters in that area. They've got to be coming from Earhart.
Okay. And what is a harmonic broadcast? Because that explains why these people in Florida, and I think there was a child in Wyoming or something, also how it was able to bounce off. Can you explain what a harmonic broadcast is?
Sure. When Earhart transmitted with her radio, with her transmitter, it put out signals on one of two primary frequencies. They were high frequencies, 3105 kilocycles, as they were called at that time, and 6210 kilocycles. And those are the signals that people around the Pacific were listening for her on. Those are the frequencies that Pan Am was taking bearings on. But at the same time the transmitter was putting out signals on those frequencies, it was also putting out signals on harmonics of those frequencies. That is, higher multiples of those frequencies. And those harmonics, and they weren't intentional, it was just sloppy, as the way radios were back then. And these harmonics, much higher frequencies, travel much greater distances with much greater clarity, but they're not predictable. They come down wherever they come down. So the people around North America who unexpectedly, accidentally start hearing Amelia Earhart's voice calling for help, they're just cruising in their shortwave dial looking for foreign stations and stumble upon a harmonic of Earhart's frequencies and are astonished to hear her calling for help.
Oh, yeah. And the Betty Klink, what she heard and what she wrote down in Florida is really quite dramatic. It's basically, it's almost like after the crash. And you actually have a copy of that notebook, I believe, don't you? You knew Betty Klink.
That's right. Betty had a notebook that she kept by her radio, and when she started hearing this, she grabbed her notebook and started to transcribe what she could make out. And we interviewed her extensively about each entry, and eventually Betty donated her notebook to our organization, and I have it here. It's an extraordinary document.
Right. But of course, another way you've proven this as well, besides just the radio signals, as you said, 57, I think, credible signals, you also have made a series of trips to the island. Have you made something like 10 trips since 89? Is that right?
I've led 10 expeditions to the island since 1989, yes.
And you found a number of evidence. One of probably the most dramatic is what you think is a piece of the Electra, which was Earhart had a crash in Hawaii, and they did some modifications to the plane, and there was a piece put on. And I think, is it your contention that you found one of those pieces and you've had it tested, I think, at MIT, and it conforms with... Could you explain that, please?
We found, this was in 1991, fairly early on, we found a section of what is very clearly a piece of airplane skin, the aluminum sheet covering of an airplane. It doesn't fit anywhere on any known aircraft, including a standard Lockheed Electra. But we know, we have photographic proof, that when Earhart was in Miami at the start of her second world flight attempt, a window on the right-hand side of the airplane that had been specially installed was replaced for some reason. We think it probably cracked. Was replaced with a plain metal aluminum sheet patch that was put over the hole. And we think the piece of metal we have is a patch.
Sorry. So it wasn't in Hawaii. It was in Miami then. So, and hasn't MIT looked at this and tested the metal? Or you've had other work to really drill down on it to prove that's the case?
We've had Alcoa, who made the aluminum, look at it, and Alcoa says, yeah, it's the right kind of aluminum. The trouble is, just about every airplane during World War II was made of that kind of aluminum. We did measurements and found that the artifact does fit where the patch was. We measured an existing Lockheed Electra and the structure, so it fits.
Okay.
MIT did was review the methodology we used to verify all this, and MIT said, yeah, I think you've done everything right. I think you've got a piece of the airplane here.
Okay. You also found some other items, like, for example, didn't you find freckle ointment and a pair of women's shoes, and a skeleton was discovered prior to this, too?
Well, let's talk about the skeleton first, because that is really solid.
Okay.
Back in 1940, when the British first were putting natives on the island to clear land, plant coconuts, build a village, a work party found a skull and buried it. A few months later, when a colonial administrator showed up, he heard about the skull and reasoned there have to be more bones if you found a skull. And he went and looked, and sure enough, way back in the bushes on a remote part of the island, he found what can only be described as a castaways campsite with a partial skeleton. The giant coconut crabs who live on the island had carried off many of the bones. But he found a partial skeleton, he dug up the skull, and he thought he'd found Amelia Earhart because there was a sextant box, a box that had once contained a nautical sextant, and he found part of a woman's shoe. And he said, well, woman's shoe, sextant, this might be Amelia Earhart.
Okay.
He notified his superiors, who eventually analyzed all this stuff and misidentified it. He decided it wasn't Earhart, and the whole thing was forgotten until we discovered the original file in 1998.
Okay, so, and I should just add, I believe that island was one of the last colonies actually colonized by the British, and it was abandoned in the 60s, I believe, and also there were U.S. troops there in World War II. Wasn't it a radar station, too, in World War II?
It was a LORAN navigation station. The Coast Guard had about 25 men at a navigation station there from 1944 until 1946. The colony was abandoned in 1963 after a severe drought. Nobody has lived on the island since then.
Okay, so those skeletal remains were then shown to be a woman after you said they were misidentified. So, and they were of the same height. She was what, 5'7", something like that?
She was 5'7", and the bone measurements, the bones have been lost, but the bone measurements that were taken by a British doctor have been evaluated by a world-class forensic anthropologist, Dr. Richard Jantz, at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and compared to Earhart's bone lengths, which we determined through forensic imaging of historical photographs, and the conclusion is there's a 99.28% chance that castaway was Amelia Earhart.
Okay, I just want to get to, have I left anything else out as far as items that you found, Mr. Gillespie, that reaffirmed this? I want to get on to a photo that you discovered fairly recently, which may have been the landing gear sticking out of the water when the British took a photo by that where you think she crashed, right? With Electra landing gear may have been sighted.
That's right. That's a fascinating piece of evidence. This is a photograph that was taken by a British expedition that visited the island only 3 months after Earhart disappeared. They weren't looking for Earhart. They were checking the place out for future settlement. And they took a bunch of pictures. And one of those pictures shows the western coastline of the island and the big old shipwreck that had been there since 1929. But what nobody noticed in the photo, and we didn't even notice until 2010, is that there is something sticking up out of the water on the reef that shouldn't be there on an uninhabited island. And forensic imaging of that object, we went to Oxford University in England to get the best possible copy of this thing, and it was verified by U.S. government photo analysts at the State Department. This thing appears to be the wreckage of landing gear of a Lockheed Electra.
Okay, so basically, yeah, you got that picture. You have the items that you found. Your theory is that she landed safely on that reef. That they were. How many days did they broadcast for, in your opinion? 4 days?
At least 5.
5, and then unfortunately they had a very sad end where they ran out of water and were basically eaten by crabs, right?
Well, it's not clear how long Fred lasted. My personal opinion, I don't think Fred lasted long at all. There are reasons. In the radio distress calls, he was frequently described as being severely injured. But it was Earhart's skeleton that was found on the other side of the island at a campsite, and based on the remains of food that were at that site in a campfire, burned turtle, fish, bird bones, that sort of thing, she survived certainly for a matter of weeks, probably a matter of months, probably not a year. But she survived by herself as a castaway on that island for quite a period of time.
Now, Mr. Gillespie, one of the things that you've obviously done is you've had to debunk some of the other theories. One of the theories that she was flown, she was captured by the Japanese, that she was deliberately overflying Japanese fortifications for basically on a spy mission for Roosevelt. But one of the things I heard you say is that you don't think she had enough fuel for that. And when that photo came out showing her, that was supposedly her in capture, you were one of the people to say that wasn't her, correct? That was an incorrect photo.
Well, yeah. That photo that was featured in a History Channel documentary is probably the most extreme case of confirmation bias I've ever heard of. This is a photo that was in a U.S. intelligence file at the National Archives of U.S. Navy intelligence gathered prior to the invasion of the Marshall Islands in 1944. It's a picture of Jalowit Harbor, and that's what the caption on the photo says it is. It's just a picture of a bunch of people standing on a dock, and you can see the harbor in the background. A perfectly logical thing for the Navy to be getting prior to the invasion of the Marshalls. A devotee of the Japanese capture theory was looking through those photographs. He sees somebody on that dock that he thinks looks like Amelia Earhart, and he suddenly jumps to the conclusion that this photograph has been misfiled. It's a secret intelligence photo, shouldn't be here, and here is the long hidden proof that the U.S. government knew she was captured by the Japanese. And it was just ridiculous. We reasoned at the time that we first saw the photo that the Navy probably found that photo in a travel book someplace, but we didn't think there was any chance we could find the book. But 2 days after the History Channel show was aired, a Japanese historian blogger did find the photo in a Japanese travel book that was published in 1935, 2 years before Earhart disappeared.
Wow, so that's pretty much been debunked then.
Oh, yeah. I'd say that.
Okay. So basically, you're organizing another exhibition, I believe, where you want to take submarines, I believe, from Hawaii and really explore that reef area and searching for the plane. You did one exhibition, but I believe the underwater machine you had wasn't working correctly, and you really weren't able to. You had an anomaly, as you called it, that you pinpointed with sonar, right? And you really haven't been able to explore that. And you think the plane is by the reef. Is that right?
We are quite sure that the airplane went off the edge of the reef and into the ocean in that location. What happened then is the big question. Everything we've found so far, and we've tried remote operated vehicles, side scan sonar on autonomous underwater vehicles, and there doesn't seem to be anything big there. So it appears that the airplane was torn apart by the surf on that reef edge, and all that's left are scattered pieces that may have then been covered in underwater landslides. There's not much left to find, if anything. The only way to be absolutely sure is to get out there with manned submersibles where you can really put brains and eyeballs down there and survey the reef. The problem is there's about a $2 million price tag to do that. If anybody wants to step forward and sponsor that, I'd be happy to talk to them.
Have you raised any money for that new exhibition? I mean, are you planning to do that next summer? Is there any guideline on when you might get this started at the submarine search?
No, there's no guideline. Where we are on that is if a sponsor would step forward and sponsor it, we'd be happy to do it. But we don't think that it's even necessary. We have more than enough evidence right now to establish, and there's no conflicting evidence, that this is what happened to Amelia Earhart. There is this popular feeling that the mystery will never be solved until the airplane is found. But where is it written that has to be the case? If the airplane no longer exists, that doesn't change the fact that that there's tons of evidence that Earhart landed and died there.
One of the things, Mr. Gillespie, too, you said that I don't believe the Electra could, if it was floating, it couldn't run the engines, and that would make basically, first of all, if she had floated on the ocean, would she have been able to broadcast, and would the airplane even have floated on the ocean at all for her to broadcast?
The airplane probably would float because it had large fuel tanks that would take a while to fill. The airplane would probably float for some period of time. But at the time, the airplane manufacturer, Lockheed, cautioned everybody, this is back in 1937, that if the airplane is floating in the water, the radio components are going to be submerged.
Okay.
It won't work. It's impossible for it to transmit if it's in the water.
So therefore, the fact that she broadcast and transmitted, she had to have been on land to broadcast.
And not only that, because the transmissions went on night after night after night, she had to be able to run the engine with the generator on it, the right-hand engine, to recharge the battery that the radio depended on. So in order to run the engine, the airplane has to be on its wheels. There was no crash. The airplane made a safe landing.
What do you say to people, Mr. Gillespie, that say that island was searched by a U.S. aircraft carrier, had a plane fly over it not too long after this, and they didn't see evidence? Do you just think they just overflew her and just missed it, or what's your theory on that?
Well, it wasn't an aircraft carrier. There was a battleship that was sent from Hawaii to search the island and other islands in the area with 3 catapult-launched float planes that were aboard the battleship.
Okay.
And they sent the ship there because of the radio signals. But when the planes overflew the island on the morning of July 9th, by then the airplane had been washed into the ocean and was no longer visible. The radio signals had stopped. But what the pilots did notice were clear signs of recent habitation on the island. The senior aviator said that... Excuse me. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Maybe it's a donor.
Right.
For your submarine trip.
Yeah. There were... where were we? Yeah.
We were talking about the overflight of the island by those planes from the battleship.
Fly the island. They see markers of some kind on the beach, and they say it's signs of recent habitation, but they didn't see any people. What they didn't know is there had been no recent habitation of the island. Nobody had been there since 1892. There should have been no sign of any such thing there. But they didn't know that. They didn't see an airplane. They didn't see a person. So they crossed the place off as having been searched, and the rest of the search took place in open ocean, and they didn't find anything.
Mr. Gillespie, why do some people dismiss? I mean, what is the basis that anyone would have to dismiss these radio signals? What do people say that dismiss this theory? How do they explain these radio signals? What can anyone possibly say to dismiss them?
Well, they don't. To the extent that anybody tries to explain them. This is Scott. Can you take this call? I'm sorry. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. To the extent that anybody tries to explain them, they just go back to what the Navy said in 1937 when the search was over and they hadn't found anything. They said, well, for these signals to have been genuine, there had to be an airplane on land. We looked on land. We didn't see an airplane on land. Therefore, all the signals have to have been bogus. The Navy never did a thorough investigation.
Okay.
They just, they had called off the search. You look at them from a political standpoint, they've gone home now, and they can't very well say, well, maybe she was out there, but maybe we just left her to die on some island. No, they just said, no, all those signals must have been bogus. And
okay.
Anybody that now tries to refute it goes back to that reference, and of course, it's not a legitimate.
Just a few more questions, Mr. Gillespie. Some people say that Earhart was not that great a pilot because of that crash in Hawaii, and obviously because of this misidentification of the island. What's your theory on her as a pilot? Was she a great pilot, or was a lot of it just hype? What's your opinion on that?
Oh, well, Amelia herself said that her record-setting flights added nothing to aviation. What her flights were stunt flights. They were designed to attract publicity, to set records, and to support her way of making a living, which was doing speaking engagements. That's how she raised money. She got $300, a lot of money in 1930s, to talk to women's groups and civic groups. So she did these flights, but she wasn't a pioneer in the sense of pioneering new technology. She just did things that hadn't been done before, and some of it was very brave, very, very bold, and she was very lucky. She wrecked a lot of airplanes. She had 11 crashes, but managed to not get hurt and help them. Good pilot? Well, there's an old saying in aviation that there are old pilots and bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. Certainly a bold pilot.
I heard you.
And
yes.
She never got to be old.
I heard you mention that this area is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's also important for global warming and kind of where these storms form. Did you have play a hand in getting this designation as a UNESCO Heritage Site?
Not intentionally. we started going out there, and the people we chartered a boat from also had done charters for the New England Aquarium, and they looked at this pristine reef environment and said, holy mackerel, we've never seen anything like this. And they passed that word on to the New England Aquarium people, who then chartered the boat to take them out to the island to look at it. And the New England Aquarium people are the ones who got in touch with the Republic of Kiribati, who owns the island, and said, look, this needs to be a protected area. And eventually it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So, it all came from our Earhart investigation. We didn't do it.
Do you see rising waters in the 25 years you've been going to that island? Have you seen the waters been rising at all in your time going there?
Not so much rising water, but certainly increased storm damage. We've seen a steady progression of in the severity of storms that hit the island and the damage that's done. When we went there in 1989, there was a building, a wood-framed building, that had been there since 1963 and was virtually intact. We went back 2 years later, and it was flattened, and by now it's completely gone. I mean, we've just seen a great increase, especially on the northwestern end of the island that gets most of the weather. A huge increase in storm damage.
Let me ask you about just a final investigation. The Glenn Miller flight, the famous band leader who died in World War II, who we think is now his planes off the coast of England. Where does that investigation stand, and what work have you done on that recently?
Just published the most recent issue of our journal, Tiger Tracks, that contains the investigative report of Phase 1 of the Miller investigation, where we've looked into the circumstances of the flight. We know what happened to him. We know what went wrong. We know what didn't happen. You know, there's a myth that his airplane was knocked down by friendly fire, by bombs that were jettisoned.
Right.
Yeah, that turns out to not have happened. It's a fascinating case. It was a totally unnecessary accident, but it was a classic aviation accident. I investigated similar accidents myself when I was in the business. You had a case where you had a couple of executives, one lieutenant colonel and Major Miller, who were very eager to get from England to France and were willing to bend the rules and violate orders to get there. And they had a pilot, a young, inexperienced pilot who was eager to prove his worth, who was willing to take chances that he shouldn't have taken. And their flight was unauthorized and unknown. Nobody knew they were doing it, and the weather was horrible. And we may never know exactly what went wrong, but it was probably ice, low weather, freezing rain, ice. They went into the channel. The big question is, can we find the wreck? And the only chance we have of finding that wreck is if it's the wreck that a fisherman with a trawler briefly recovered back in 1987. This guy, his net hung up on something. He pulled it up to the surface, and it hung in his nets for a couple of hours. It was an airplane that he later sketched a sketch of it, and it looks like the same kind of airplane Miller disappeared in. So we need to find out if that wreck he pulled up is still there, and if it's the Miller airplane. That's what we're working toward.
Okay. Well, Mr. Gillespie, I'm out of time, but thank you so much for your time. The website it's pronounced Tiger, your organization, right. But it's tighar.org. If people want to learn more information, obviously donate. You have no plans as of yet for another expedition to the island, right? As of now?
Not at this time, no.
Okay. So thank you, Mr. Gillespie, for your time. Our website is intelligenttalk.com. We've been speaking with Rick Gillespie here. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thanks a lot, Ralph.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Hi, I'm Janice Ian. Do you remember how excited you were at the start of summer every year, and how the summer just started to drag on after a few months, and you couldn't wait to get back to school, see your old friends, make new friends, get new books and a new locker and a clean slate? Well, you should have been excited about music class, too, because that was a special room where you went to sing, perform with your friends, and learn all kinds of interesting stuff about great composers, instruments, different kinds of music and songs. We remember our music teachers because they were so passionate about helping us learn to love music. They helped to spark a love for listening to notes and voices and rhythms that continues to enrich our lives even today. I bet your kids feel the same way about music class. Ask them, and make sure they get involved with music in school and in their lives.
A PSA brought to you by MENC, the National Association for Music Education, and the National Anthem Project, the campaign to restore America's voice through music education. Music, part of a sound education.
Today's entertainment has been brought to you in part by Galito's Restaurant. Galito's specializes in Portuguese cuisine. In addition to these delicacies, Galito's offers pasta, steaks, seafood, and chops. A full-service bar includes wines, beers, and spirits to complement your meal. Galito's offers casual ambiance at the bar or their dining room. Galito's also has a private banquet room for social events with a party package to accommodate your budget. Galito's also offers seasonal cafe seating. Galito's is located at 29 Elm Avenue in Mount Vernon, New York, conveniently located across from the Mount Vernon East train station. You can call Galito's at area code 914-668-0100. Once again, the number is area code 914-668-0100 for information on reservations, or go to the website at www.galitosrestaurant.com. Enjoy your dining experience. Voted #1 jazz cabaret club by New York Magazine, the Metropolitan Room is one of the most critically acclaimed venues in New York City and is known as the home for big-name talents and rising stars. Known as a celebrity hangout, the Metropolitan Room is a high-end cabaret and jazz club and brings the best in live music to New York City every night of the week. Fabulous award-winning Broadway, TV, film, and radio performers take the stage in an intimate 115-seat elegant venue. Aside from the great, highly professional artistic shows and audience, Metropolitan Room provides an exceptional appetizer and dessert menu as well as exotic and specialty drinks prepared by top New York City bartenders. The Metropolitan Room is located at 34 West 22nd Street, conveniently located near public transportation. For information or reservations, call area code 212-206-0440. Once again, the area code is 212-206-0440. Or go to their website at www.metropolitanroom.com.